So good morning, everybody. Wonderful to see so many of you here and more on on the internet connection. There are so many insects in the world. I think most of the species are insect species. And what you have to do is, if you study them, 1 million species, and maybe I don't know how many million that we don't know, you have to name them and you can learn of them. So this is something for a training, right? Names like Axanthosomella, just memorize, or Crematogaster, or Xenos, right? These were all hymenopterans. You can name the family name, you can remember that, and the species name, which is the second part of that. But that's easier because it comes with repeated names. So Axanthosomella is Gadagkar, and Crematogaster is Gadagkar, and Xenos is Gadagkar. Right? They have the same name, and it is Raghavendra Gadagkar, right, who has the privilege of having several species named after him. Right? What kind of entomologist are you that you have a few of these species, hymenopterans, that take your name? Well, Raghavendra is a professor and senior scientist at the Center for Ecological Sciences, and he will give us a talk today, and I will speak very little because I want all the time to be there for you. But let me tell you two things among the long list of accolades that he has. He is a senior fellow in the Zukunftskolleg at the University of Constance, is a guest today here in the cluster, has worked with many here in our departments in Constance. He was a permanent fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, where we got to know. He helped us in the advisory board of the Zukunftskolleg, also creating new formats of that. So many things. When I looked through the list of what could I tell you, I thought it was so long, I just stopped there. But have a look at his homepage, have a look at what he published, many papers and books. And let me give you one title as an example: How to Design Experiments in Animal Behavior, Cutting Edge Research at a Trifling Cost. Right? The idea here being, well, if you are an entomologist, if you are a scientist, what is the essence of doing science? The essence is finding the right question. And finding the question sometimes in your backyard, right? Not looking for the most expensive equipment and for the most complicated experiment, but finding the question, finding a clear experiment that gives a clear answer, and that can be in your backyard. And then from that answer, go on to the next question. Right? And always do that with a lot of fun. That is another one of his books. Fun, right? Create the fun in thinking, create the fun in developing ideas and looking at the science that you do yourself, at the science that others do, right? Check out his blog, something fun. What was the fun in the fun? More fun than fun. So even more fun than fun. And there's so much more to say, but for now, I'm really glad that you're here. He just came back yesterday from Berlin, spending a week in Berlin, so it's double an honor to have you here this morning, and we are really looking forward to your talk, The Story of Caste and Nutrition in a Social Wasp.
I would like to begin by thanking Ian for the kind invitation to give this talk, Alexandra for her wonderful hospitality, and Giovanni for his very generous introduction. I must confess right in the beginning that I am trying to do something very ambitious today. First, I've never given this talk before. And second, I want to tell you a story that began exactly 40 years ago in 1985 and continues to this day. Of course, I've been working with this wasp species all my life, but today I'm going to take one thread in our research, and that is the role of nutrition. And the role of nutrition came back to us accidentally many times, and I want to try and weave all of this together and try and tell you this in a form of story. But first, some introduction. So first, a very brief introduction to insect societies. And as a backdrop, I have put the image of this wonderful book, one of the first rigorous books on caste in social insects, exploring the role of ecology in caste in social insects, written by a mathematician, George Oster, and an entomologist, Edward Wilson, in 1978. But I'm just putting this as a backdrop to set the stage. So division of labor, which I will abbreviate often as DOL, is a fundamental property of social insects. Thus, different individuals specialize in different tasks. Such differentially specialized individuals historically have been called castes. And there are two kinds of division of labor. One is what we call reproductive division of labor, and this is the difference between sterile workers and fertile queens or kings in the case of termites. But also amongst the sterile workers, there is non-reproductive division of labor, so that subsets of workers are specialized in subsets of non-reproductive castes. So there are nurses, guards, soldiers, foragers, undertakers, and so on. I put that one in red color because that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk, reproductive division of labor. Secondly, I want to say a little bit about reproductive division of labor, or reproductive caste differentiation. This is the phrase we use. There are social insects can be classified broadly into two kinds, so-called primitive and advanced. This is simply to distinguish between those who are more specialized and more sophisticated and those who are more like solitary insects. So in the highly social or advanced social insects, the differentiation, now we are only going to talk about reproductive caste differentiation. So queen versus worker. This decision is made in the very early larval stage. As most of you would know, an adult insect in a holometabolous species is called an imago. So the differentiation is pre-imaginal, usually in very early larval stage, and therefore it is really a matter of developmental regulation of how an individual develops either into a sterile worker or into a fertile queen. Somewhat boring. In the primitively eusocial insects, this differentiation is post-imaginal, that is after the adult comes out, and therefore is a matter of social or behavioral regulation, or a political matter if you like, and that makes it much more interesting, and that's what I study. And the species I study is a primitively eusocial species, and we are interested in post-imaginal or caste differentiation in this. Now a little bit about this. Ropalidia marginata is abundantly distributed all over peninsular India. It builds its nest everywhere. Maybe I should put on a picture. So small nest, 20, 30, 40, 50 individuals, they can all be individually marked. There is no morphological difference between queens and workers. So amongst these, one of them is the queen, but you cannot tell until you actually watch her laying an egg. They build honeycomb-like nests made of paper. They manufacture paper themselves, and it's a two-dimensional nest, not covered with an envelope as some other wasps do. So you can watch everything, and you can mark all the individuals with many, many spots of colored paint, and you can have names for this. And in fact, we have computer files on hundreds and thousands of wasps, and which we put in their lifetime information. So we have dossiers on all of them. So it's very easy to study them. They are all over. In fact, often they come and build their nest in my lab. I don't have to go looking for them. We can study them quite easily wherever they are, but we can also very easily transplant them into the laboratory and put them in all kinds of cages. We can put them in little plastic boxes. As I will tell you in many experiments, we can put them in slightly larger cages or in even larger walk-in cages. But we are interested in reproductive caste differentiation, and just to indicate the difference in the ovaries. So a worker will have these kinds of atrophied ovaries, and a queen will have these kind of ovaries where there are these oocytes ready to be laid. How does this difference come about? That's really what we are interested in. Why do some individuals have ovaries of this kind throughout their life, and why do some individuals rapidly develop ovaries of this kind? Sometimes individuals with these ovaries will go back to this situation. So both these things are possible, and that's really what we are interested in. Okay, so since it's a primitively eusocial species, since caste differentiation is supposed to be post-imaginal, but this is what the textbook tells you. This is not what the wasp tells you. And we want to ask the wasp when caste differentiation actually happens. So we decided to investigate the timing of caste determination in this. Is it really pre-imagined? Because as Giovanni said, there are thousands, maybe millions of species, and what the textbook tells you never guaranteed that that will actually happen. So it's worth investigating this. And we did 2 experiments to do this. The reason why we did 2 experiments is we simply repeated the old experiment again a second time, and I'll tell you why. So is reproductive caste differentiation entirely post-imaginal in Ropalidia marginata? That was our question. Now, how do we answer this question, or how do we test this? We argued that if caste differentiation is the result of behavioral and social regulation, if we abolish behavioral and social regulation, there should be no caste differentiation. So we argued that if this is true, all eclosing female wasps should be capable of developing their ovaries and laying eggs when they are not subject to social interactions. So it is social interactions which must make some sterile and others fertile. But in solitary insects, we know that everybody is fertile. So if you remove social interactions, everybody should become a fertile queen. That's the prediction. Now, to test this prediction, we collected lots of wasps. We put them in isolation so that there is no social interaction. From the time they came out of the pupal case, we put them in isolation in those little plastic boxes I showed you, and we followed their fate. And throughout the experiment, you'll find that we have obscenely large sample sizes. Very large sample sizes. And in the book I'm writing now, I have a little paragraph about why we had much larger sizes than necessary. In a nutshell, this is for someone sitting in Bangalore to make an impact in the world. You should do something special, and that is very large sample size. That was the easiest thing for us to do. But I've described that in some detail in my book. Okay, so important thing is we had the luxury of working with wasps in little plastic boxes, so we could really have hundreds of them. We also had the luxury of working with virgin wasps, because if you have to get a wasp to mate, then do the experiment, it already is, there is some social interaction, it's already of different ages, you can't really control. But we had this great luxury because even in little plastic boxes, virgin wasps will build nests, they will develop their ovaries and lay eggs, they will forage, feed, and bring their offspring to adulthood. And if there's more than wasps, even the unmated wasp can become the sole egg layer in a group that may include other mated wasps, showing that mating is really not important for us. So we were confident of working with virgin wasps. And as I said, we could put them in little plastic boxes. These plastic boxes, we just go to the market and buy. These are used in the kitchen to store things, and we could have hundreds of them. And this is what the box would look like. In fact, you can see a wasp inside here, and we can store a large number of these wasps, as many boxes as you want. Now, what did we find? Of the 197 wasps that we tested, and these are all virgin wasps, 97, that is 49%, successfully built nests and laid at least one egg, and we called these the egg layers. And we stopped the experiment as soon as we saw one leg. But the remaining 100 wasps, 51%, died without doing so, and we called them the non-egg layers. So in the experiment, we had egg layers and non-egg layers, 50% egg layers, 50% non-egg layers. Almost equal. One might say this is the most uninteresting result or a most trivial result because it doesn't tell you anything. Maybe, but we want to find it, or maybe it is trivial. So first we said maybe it's a trivial result. Maybe the non-egg layers died too soon, and that's why they could not lay eggs. We checked that, but that's not true, because the non-egg layers lived longer than the time taken by the egg layers to lay their first egg. So it couldn't be early mortality that is responsible for this. The other trivial thing we wanted to exclude was egg laying could be seasonal. Individuals eclosing some time of the year may become egg layers, others non-egg layers, and we didn't worry about seasons, so maybe just by accident we saw some egg layers and non-egg layers. Is this because egg laying is seasonal? Answer is no, because now when you look at the data, you find that every season there is no significant difference between the number of egg layers and the non-egg layers. In fact, it's very interesting because I used to have a blackboard and chalk in my lab, and every day when an individual died, we would increase one tally in the dead animals, and if one laid an egg, we would include that. And actually from day one, this 1:1 ratio stayed almost to the end. It was uncanny. But it didn't make any sense why this should be true. Maybe, so we said, maybe not. There must be something happening in this. Now, in order to study this further, we decided to do something. We had information. So first we said, let's repeat the experiment. This sounds really crazy. So we repeated the experiment with another 102 wasps, and we got exactly the same result. Now we had this result. Now, what can we conclude? First, we can conclude that caste determination is not entirely post-imaginal. That we can conclude, because you don't expect 50% of the individuals to become queens if it is. And it is not entirely pre-imaginal either. Neither of this is entirely true. And so we invented a phrase called pre-imaginal caste bias. If it was pre-imaginal entirely, I would expect a few individuals to become egg layers and the vast majority to become non-egg layers, because in nature every colony has just one queen. If it was entirely post-imaginal, I would have expected everybody to become egg layers in the lab, but that didn't happen either. So we created this phrase called pre-imaginal caste bias, and we argued that some bias is happening in the pre-imaginal stage and the fine-tuning happens later on. And how does the fine-tuning happen? We speculated that most queens in nature would come from our egg layers in the laboratory, and most workers in nature would come from the non-egg layers in our laboratory. So there is some bias, there's a pool from which you can make some queens, but not everybody becomes a queen. From the others you can make workers, but not everybody might become a worker. So there is some bias in, that was our argument. Now, we had some data on the properties of the wasp. We had measured the body size of the wasp in various places, and when we were doing these experiments, we would feed the wasp with caterpillars of a rice moth called Corcella cephalonica. And for no reason at all, we took great pains to measure food consumed by every wasp every day. At that time, we had no reason why. We just did it because we wanted to do it. In fact, the most tedious part of the experiment was to keep track of food consumption. So every day we would measure how much we gave and how much was left, and we kept track of this. And now we said we have this data, so let's also include feeding rate in this. And when we ran a logistic regression model, because this was a binary egg layer, non-egg layer, right? So we found that only feeding rate was significantly associated with becoming an egg layer and non-egg layer. So it's a complete serendipity. We did not even know why we measured this, but that was the only thing that became significant. So there is some role of adult nutrition in this process of becoming an egg layer and non-egg layer. And so we want to think of what might be the role of adult nutrition. So we speculated that pre-imaginal caste bias channels some wasps into developmental pathways that result in adults who feel more hungry, and they feed more and they become egg layers. And other wasps are channeled into an alternate developmental pathway that results into adults who feel less hungry and eat less and become non-egg layers. This is because we gave unlimited food to everybody. So obviously those who ate less didn't feel hungry. That's the only thing we could say. But of course the real question was, what is the mechanism of pre-imaginal caste bias that actually channels developing larvae into these two alternate development pathways? What is actually the mechanism? Now we also had some data on the nest property. There's a typo there, it should be nest. So from the nest, so when we collected the wasps from nests in nature, we kept track of the number of eggs, the number of larvae, the number of pupae, the number of parasitized cells, empty cells, number of males and females in the parent nest from which these wasps eclosed. And we said maybe that has some influence on them. And again we got the craziest possible result. The only significant variable was the number of empty cells, which at that time we thought was completely crazy, because we don't take empty cells seriously. A few cells are left empty because the queen has not laid egg or there has not been something. So we never took that seriously. We thought all of these things may be far more important. But it turned out the only significant variable was the number of empty cells. So what is the role of empty cells? What could be the significance of empty cells? Thought about it for a great deal, and we came up with a kind of conceptual model, which I will show in the next slide. There's too much text in this, so I'll read it for you. The idea is as follows, that sometimes in a young and if there's a young and healthy queen, or the queen is in a state where the colony is in a state where you want more workers. In such a situation, there must be some increased influence of the queen, and that can result with cells not being left. So queen is young, active, healthy, so she lays eggs, so there are no empty cells, and she somehow influences the larvae and makes the brood to develop into adults programmed to feed less and therefore become workers. On the contrary, when the queen is weak, dying, old, sick, or the colony has grown and wants to make new queens, then the queen's influence declines for whatever reason, resulting, of course, in cells being left empty because she's not strong anymore, not laying enough eggs, but also results in the effect on the brood to become programmed to feed more hungry and become larger. Now, of course, as you have noticed, I have not said anything new. I have only summarized what we found, but I have isolated the mystery. So the mystery are these processes by which these things are channeled. So by isolating and focusing on the mystery, we hope that we can try and understand what could Y be and what could X be. What is Y? New nests with young and healthy queens will have few or no empty cells. There will be a modest workforce busy expanding the nest to match the queen's egg-laying rate. Therefore, food will be limited because there are very few workers foraging. Food must be shared with a relatively large number of larvae, and therefore there is less nourishment for the larvae. Larvae, therefore, develop into adults that feel less hungry and become egg layers. So now we are going one step back and saying it's not just adult nutrition, but it's also larval nutrition. This is all speculation, by the way. And on the other hand, what is X? Old nests, old and unhealthy queens, they leave behind more empty cells. Strong workforce not expanding the nest, queens not laying many eggs. More food is available because there are many workers, very few larvae. Food must be shared with a relatively small number of larvae. Relatively more nourishment for the larvae, resulting in larvae developing into individuals who feel more hungry and become queens. Pure speculation, but this seemed plausible. So the empty cell is just a correlate. It has no significance, but it gives us a clue to the health of the queen, which we had never thought of earlier. Now, this is speculation, but of course it can be tested. So we did a third experiment to understand the role of larval nutrition. Here we made the experiment even more tedious. We spent several weeks with each nest studying everything about that nest and measuring especially the rate at which larvae were fed in that nest in nature before collecting the nest and getting wasps to eclose from that nest to study. So we knew the past history of those adult wasps when they were larvae, what kind of food they were getting. And we did this for some 80 or 90 wasps, and we found, so this is the third, so we repeated the experiment again, except with more information about the state of the nest from which these wasps eclosed. And we found, in fact, a significant effect of the number of times an average larva was fed in each. So we only had data nest-wise. For each nest, we knew the rate at which larvae were fed in this nest. So we were trying to capitalize on the natural variation from nest to nest. Intra-nest variation, we had no way of measuring or controlling. That's very difficult to measure. But for various reasons, between nests, there would be variation. And I would expect that the between nest variation is very important because we already said that some nests, very large nests would behave in some way and small nests would behave another way. So it's inter-nest variation that we could capture, and we in fact found that there is a clear effect of the number of times larvae were fed when you look at the eclosion. So now if you summarize all the three experiments, because basically the experiments are the same, so you find this result of 50-50. So in some 51% and 49%. And so far, we had only, the experiment was you feed the wasp every day, you clean the cage, etc. And when the first egg is laid, you terminate that experiment, and if the wasp dies, you terminate it. But we had no clue of the dynamics of the development of the ovaries. So we said, now we'll do another experiment where we will try and look at how the ovaries are developing with time. This is of course an even more tedious experiment, because we would harvest a whole bunch of boxes at the end of 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 10 weeks and so on, and measure the ovaries of those wasps. So now we had many, many more wasps, and when we did that, we found that in fact there is a course of ovarian development. So this is what the raw data would look like. There's lots of variation, and then if you can fit some models, you can actually show a certain pattern of ovarian development. Now, of course, with statistics you can show this pattern, but the pattern is not of interest. What is of interest is the enormous variation and the enormous variability. That to me was far more interesting. Such flexibility and variation in the probability and timing of reproductive development, which I would suspect is governed by nutrition, may physiologically predispose some females to accept worker roles and others to become queens. And so now there is already we are seeing an adaptive significance of this variation. If there's already this variation, the fitness cost for an individual to accept the sterile worker role is very low. Whereas for those individuals who have very well developed ovaries, the fitness cost is very high and they would probably prefer to become queens. So we already are beginning to see an adaptive significance of this variation. Finally, everything induced probably by nutrition. There's another question that I was always interested in. Can an individual become a queen and then go back and become a worker? Or can an individual be a worker for a long time and then go back and become a queen? This is the question. And the way we did this experiment, again we studied many nests in nature. We found out what the wasps were doing, and then we collected every wasp from every nest and put each one in a plastic box. And we followed the fate of this. Now, can these wasps build a nest and lay eggs in isolation? So far they have been in a social group and they have either been queens or workers. Can they do so? The basic result was about half the workers did so and half didn't, as we expected. None of the queens did. None of the queens were able to go back and build a nest and become workers. But if you give them workers who will build nests, they would lay eggs. So I cannot imagine that they have forgotten how to build a nest. I can only say they're too lazy. They are so used to having work. But the workers are interesting. And in the case of workers, we found that some of them did. And again, when we ran a model, we found the following variables to be important. How often they fed themselves, and their age, and so basically two things, their age and the feeding became important. Now the age is complicated because for the constraints of doing such a massive experiment, we did not have animals of all ages. We only had some ages. So in our experiment, the older ones laid eggs. But if we had even older ones, there might have been a bell-shaped curve. But the most interesting thing was that the rate at which they were feeding was very important. That is, the rate at which the wasps were feeding before we collected them in their social life. And that helped a lot. So this is what the data would look like. So if this is age, so probability of becoming queens decreases with age. With feeding rate, it increases with feeding rate. So the older an individual, the less likely it would be able to revert back and become a queen. And the better fed it is, the more likely it will become a queen in future. Actually, when we wrote the paper, we highlighted a different result, which was the most interesting result, and that is, we expected that if a worker works very hard, then she will lose her ability to go back and lay eggs. And we found this is not true. In fact, we found that there was no effect of the rate of work done. And this is what we highlighted in the paper. We said because of this, individuals can combine in their lifetime direct fitness and indirect fitness. You work for some time for the queen, get indirect fitness, then you switch over and start laying eggs and become queens. And the fact that you have worked does not reduce your chances or probability or success in becoming future. That's the process. That's a result we highlighted in the paper, but here I want to highlight is that it's the feeding rate that really matters. So once again, we see an effect of feeding rate. So nutrition again. Nutrition not only enhances the probability that wasps will become egg layers and even become early egg layers, as we have seen in other experiments. I haven't shown you the data. In that variation, nutrition affected individuals to become early egg layers, but also increases the potential of the wasp to revert to egg laying after working as non-egg layers. The next step is what I call the dynamics of nest foundation. Many individuals from these colonies will leave their nest of birth and go and make their own nests. They either do it singly or in groups, and that is one way in which they can switch from worker role to queen role, and they may do it at different times in their lifestyle. Therefore, if you go and look at nests in nature, you will find solitary nests as well as multiple, single foundress nests as well as multiple foundress nests. Now, after many years of study, we had very little information about new nest foundation. Who does it, why, when, and the reason why I had very little information was a very trivial reason. When we observe the wasps in nature, we find many new nests initiated, but we don't know where those wasps came from. We don't know what they were doing before they came here. We studied many nests in the laboratory and we saw individuals leave, but we don't know where they went and what they did. So we couldn't complete this loop between leaving and founding a new nest. We could see them leaving, we could see them founding, but we couldn't complete the loop. Because in the laboratory cages, even in those wooden cages that we had, there wasn't enough space for them to build a new nest. If the cage door was open, then they would leave. So to solve that problem, we did something very simple. So we asked which wasps leave their natal nest to found new nest, and in order to be able to study this, we constructed these large walk-in cages where, as I always say, I could put the wasp and the student inside so that observations could be made. And in this nest, there was enough space for many new nests to be initiated. In fact, in the very first experiment, in the walk-in cages, we observed 29 new nest foundations from 9 parent nests, 9 single foundress and 20 multiple. So we had 9 such cages, 9 nests brought in, transplanted here, and then studied them until individuals went off and found new nests. So we were able to do this. Now, the answer to that question is that behaviorally dominant and well-fed, again nutrition, well-fed wasps tend to leave their natal nest to found new nests either singly or jointly. The most interesting thing is they prepare in a very special way for this future by altering their behavior both on the nest and off the nest. Now again, off the nest for the first time we were able to witness, because in nature you don't see what happens. In this experiment, the cage had both on-nest behavior and off-nest behavior. And we discovered for the first time that there's very interesting off-nest behavior, especially when they wish to build a new nest. What are these unusual behaviors? Wasps congregated outside their parent nest and showed dominant subordinate interactions before initiating multiple foundress nests. This we never see happening. So if a group of wasps want to go, they will go settle down in some neutral place before building a new nest. There they will fight with each other and they will decide who the queen will be and who the workers will be. Then they will go and make a new nest. And if an individual is satisfied with the outcome, she will go back to the old nest and not join them. We have even seen situations where individuals not satisfied go back to the old nest. After 2 days they say, oh, this sucks even more, and now go and join. We have also seen this happen. And we have seen individuals who join, come back. The most dominant wasp of such aggregations always became the queen in multiple nests, and others became co-foundresses or did not join the new nest. Now, when an individual wants to build a nest solitarily, of course she doesn't participate in any of this. She only feeds herself well and she goes and starts a new nest. Solitary foundresses and future queens of multiple foundress nests engage in self-feeding behavior by wasps that did not initiate new nests. Now, typically wasps, they find food, they bring it to the nest and share it with everybody. They never eat there. But for the first time we found that wasps were eating away from the nest. Those which wanted to start new nests actually were feeding outside. So this is how they were preparing for this. Because of this, I started thinking of the wasp somewhat differently. And I said to myself, now we could test the hypothesis that wasps are not pre-programmed robots. Modeling their evolution as a competition between bearers of alternate alleles with fixed behaviors can be completely misleading. Clearly, the wasps must be making and changing decisions continuously based on updating their information about their internal state and the state of the external world. They must have these databases, they must somehow be updating their database, and they must be making their decisions on a daily basis and changing their decisions. Otherwise, you would not expect such behavior. This gives us hope that we can change their behavior by changing their internal or external state. If the wasps are of this kind, then we can actually change their behavior. And that was sort of our next goal. So we wanted to make designer wasps. Can we make the wasp selfish or altruistic as desired? This is where I will talk about experiments 7 and 8. I'm very fond of this statement that Richard Feynman made. He says, what I cannot build, I do not understand. If I can make wasps more selfish, then I will claim I understand them. Or if I can make them altruistic, then only I will claim that I can understand. So if I can build, I can understand, and that's the desire for making designer wasps. Our experiment to make wasps more selfish was as follows. We transplanted 12 R. marginata nests into the wasperi, each in a separate cage, separate walk-in cage that I've already described. We randomly assigned nests into either a control or a test category. 6 control nests, 6 experimental nests. This was even more tedious, the experiment to do. We provided ad libitum food to all nests, control as well as experiment. Everybody had ad libitum, unlimited food, honey and water every day. But in addition, in the experimental nests, we hand-fed all the wasps. We actually took pieces of corsor larvae and held it in front of the wasp. Initially, they would be afraid, they would run away, then they would come back and take it. And we kept on doing this till they said no more. And they would take it and feed it to the larvae and come back, share it with others, come back. And we tried this every single wasp on the nest, every other day. So in addition to the ad libitum food, we hand-fed all the wasps in 6 nests, not every alternate day, twice every day, in the morning and in the evening. And these could have 20, 30 individuals. So we had well-fed wasps and normally fed wasps. Wasps which fed on the ad libitum food, whatever they want. Here, ad libitum food plus hand-fed wasps. During each hand-feeding session, we offered larvae to each adult female present on the parent nest until the time they did not accept any more larvae. And offer simply actually means holding that corsoral larva in a forceps and going as close to the wasp as possible until she actually takes it from you. This sounds very strange because few centimeters away there was a petri dish full of larvae. But it made a difference between whether we actually fed them. All mothers with young children would understand the difference here. So first we wanted to make sure there was actually a difference in the feeding rate. We measured how much they took from the petri plates and how much they took from our hands. And we showed clearly that there was a 1.7-fold increase in the feeding rate in the experimental nest compared to the control nest. So at least we have been able to manage to do that. It's not as if the control nest fed enough from the petri dish to compensate for what we get. There was really a significant difference. Then we found, to our great surprise, that there was a 3-fold increase in the test nest compared to the control nest in the probability of new nest foundation. The probability that wasps will leave their parent nest and go and make a new nest increased 3-fold if you fed them, hand-fed them. Not only that, in typical nests, sometimes the workers will chase away their queens and become new queens in the old nest. And the probability of doing this queen turnover or change increased 12-fold when we actually hand-fed the wasps. So the queens were in trouble when we hand-fed the workers. There was a 12-fold increase in changing the queen in the same nest and a 3-fold increase in going out and starting your own new nest. So the answer to our question is yes, we can make designer wasps and we can make them more selfish. We can make them have a higher probability of leaving their natal nest and founding new nests or getting more direct fitness. So we can make designer wasps. So perhaps we understand the wasp to some extent. I want to end by summarizing and by talking about nutrition as the key to caste in social insects. We've seen the effect of nutrition in each stage. But I want to end with something else, and I want to ask, is this good science? The answer is yes, for a very different reason. The reason is, like all good science, this line of research, while answering a fundamental question, opened up a major new puzzle. That's the hallmark of good science. And what is that puzzle? If consuming more food can make the wasps into queens rather than workers, why don't they all feed more? We provide them with ad libitum food kept nearby. Why do they do so only when we hand feed them? That they don't feel hungry is no longer an adequate explanation, because when we hand feed them, they seem to feel hungry. They don't feel hungry when the food is in the petri dish. Why should they do this? I have no clue whatsoever. Clearly, we have to go back to work. We think we have understood a great deal, but actually, there's a fundamental question remaining. So in some ways, for me, this is even more paradoxical than how an individual becomes a queen or a worker. There's food nearby, you don't feed, and if I hand feed you, you feed, and then you get huge amount of Darwinian fitness. And this is not something that I don't understand, and I'm glad that we open up a whole new line of research which needs to be done because of what we've done so far. I just want to close by saying, some of you who don't know, that some of this book is a summary of the field. This book summarizes our research for about 20 years, and now I'm writing another book which summarizes the 40 years of research. I also have written a book, as Giovanni mentioned, called Experiments in Animal Behavior. 1/3 of this book is about the wasps. The remaining 2/3 is about other things. And I want to end by thanking very large number of students who not only fed the wasps but did other things. I want you to reflect on the fact that all this work needed no money. We needed no equipment. We almost didn't need a laboratory. Our laboratory is the terrace of the building in which we put a wire mesh around so that the Vespa, bigger wasp, doesn't come eat our wasp. Needed almost no money, almost no equipment, almost nothing else, but needed lots and lots of students who were motivated, passionate, hardworking. When I got grants, I used it to pay the salaries of these students. And in the early days, I used to use part of the grants to buy them laptops. Now they come with better laptops than I can buy them, so I don't even need that. So none of these needed money, but it required the use of the brain, not just my brain, but all of these brains. I often emphasize this in my talks, and what happens is that in some cases, when I go to visit other institutions, as part of the tour, they said, we want to show you our sophisticated instruments laboratory. And they take me to a place where there are lots of interesting machines and so on, which is fine. I have no problem with that. The problem is when people come to my lab, say, can we see your sophisticated instrument laboratory? Do you have one? I said, of course I have one. Here it is. This is my sophisticated instruments that I use in my research. I will stop here and take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Raghavendra, for this wonderful talk. I'm sure there are plenty of questions.
Yeah, thank you. So I was wondering, in your hand feeding experiments, whether you also tested the larvae right after, whether they had a high probability of being an egg layer or not, because they should be better fed, right? So they should be less likely to...
That would be a huge experiment. We haven't done that, no. Because that would be waiting for those to become adults and test them. We haven't done that. But yeah, it would be a wonderful thing to do. But there is a problem, because even before we hand-fed the adult wasp, we wondered why not hand-feed the larvae. There is a problem. Many kinds of problems. First is, if I hand-feed a larva, it is very likely that the adults will compensate and not feed it. Because when the adults go, they are very, very deliberate in choosing the larva they have to feed. And I suspect strongly that they will feed hungry larvae. And if I feed them, the adults will simply undo what I am doing. So it's very difficult to tell. And the other thing is, even measuring larval food rate is actually very difficult, because I'd simply measure how many times they were fed. I don't have a way of measuring the weight. So we haven't done those experiments, but it would be wonderful to do that. But wouldn't you say that it would be a confirmation what we already found? Because we already found that number of times they're fed is significantly correlated with their probability of becoming eggs. So it would be a confirmation.
And do you know whether there's any policing signal from the queen that prohibits workers to leave?
Workers to?
To leave.
To leave.
That prohibits basically the selfishness of...
Okay, so what we know is that the queen in this species, quite unexpectedly, in primitively used species, usually queens are very dominant individuals. And it is through physical domination and physical harassment that they sort of control their workers and regulate the colony. This species is very unusual, that the queen is a very mild, docile individual, hardly interacts with her workers, and but she produces a pheromone. And it is through pheromone. So we know that the pheromone is attractive to the workers. We know that the pheromone regulates the activities of the workers. We suspect that the pheromone also suppresses the ovarian development. Because we've also done experiments where we have tried to prevent the queen from producing the pheromone. And then we find that she's attacked and so on. So we have evidence for a role of pheromone in this.
Cool, thanks.
On the topic of policing, I was wondering, is there any social policing of self-feeding that might be suppressing it in the cases where otherwise...
We've looked very hard and we haven't found any evidence of that.
I was wondering, in your feeding experiment, you analyzed food quantity so far. How about food quality? Because one of the things that you do is you provide them with ad libitum nectar and ad libitum larvae.
Yes.
So they get carbohydrates and proteins. And maybe feeding on the nectar is easier. Whereas when you hand feed them, you always feed them larvae, so you get them more proteins. So the quality of your hand-fed animals is different, the food that you give them, because you give them more protein. So could the difference be not just in the quantity, but also in the quality if you have more proteins? And is there an experiment that you're planning that would look at food quality rather than quantity?
Yeah, the only way to do that would actually to feed them with different qualities of food, which we have not yet done. But the question still remains, why don't they go and take the protein from the Petri plate? That question still remains, because it's available. It's not that we have prevented them.
Yeah,
so
you
the difference,
give them sweets, they go for the sweets, and then they end up not being.
Yeah, but I would be surprised because the difference in Darwinian fitness between these two strategies is so great that I would be surprised if it is just a matter of laziness or bad training or whatever. There was something very fundamental in this which I won't understand. But yeah, we have to find. I'm not sure how we would vary the quality of the food. I'm still not sure. We'd think about it.
So I might have missed it but I'm wondering, what do you think is happening that prevents them? What's your hypothesis that kind of prevents them to eat more, and if it's socially regulated, and if it is, if you looked at the isolated experiments, did they eat more? Like, I think you did say that there was variability, but I don't know if you compare it to when they were together, whether individually they ate more, which suggests it's socially suppressed.
There's a huge variability both when they're isolated and when they're in social groups. The thing that I still want to use to go ahead is the larval nutrition, which makes them different as adults. And if I had not found that hand-fed wasps will do things differently, then I would have said I have probably solved the problem. Less starved larvae will have a different physiology, well-fed larvae will have a different physiology, then they'll become adults, and I can imagine how an individual can be programmed to feel more hungry or less, all that. The problem is the last experiment where any wasp, if you feed them more, then they do things differently. So now the only question is, why do they feed more? So a trivial explanation could be that There are some which are more hungry, some which are less hungry. But even the ones who feel less hungry, if you feed them, then it's very artificial. So they don't have a choice. So, they just take it. So you're maybe making that artificial. But there's a lot of variability both when they are in groups and when they are alone. And this variability, I think, is natural, and I think it is adaptive, and it is very helpful for a species like this, where the chances of you getting a chance to become a queen is highly variable. In small nests, most workers may get a chance to become egg layers in their time as the queen is replaced. In a large nest, it may be very difficult for anybody to get a chance. And then they have to go out, that's their only hope. And going out is very risky. So we have found that, we have estimated that only about 5% of wasps risk the chance of starting their own nests, and 95% prefer to be in groups. So that's very risky. So the variability, I think, is very useful. The last part is still, for me, very puzzling. In the back
Thank
there.
you for
Yes.
the talk. So I actually wanted to ask you something about the workers that don't take part in dominance displays and just go and lay their eggs. So apart from feeding at the food source, do they also, for example, participate in nest maintenance or?
No, when I say don't participate, not on the nest. On the nest they participate in these off-nest aggregations. So individuals who want to build a nest by themselves don't go to these aggregations. But on the nest, they are not different from the others. On the nest, they are like any other individual. But if they decide to build a solitary nest, then they will just feed themselves both on the nest and off the nest. They will also be dominant individuals, and they'll go off on their own. But when they want to go in a group, then they go in a group, and there they have another round of fights, if you like, and then make the decision who will be the queen and who will be the worker.
I was really interested in the interaction between age and nutrition. If they are equally well fed, do wasps of all ages lay equally healthy brood? Or does the age affect how healthy the brood is later on?
Short answer is I don't know, but to think about it, I would suspect that there is a correlation between age and nutrition which is very hard to break. Because there may be a natural tendency to vary your food intake as a function of age. So in some sense, a 1-week-old wasp and a 6-week-old wasp with the same level of nutrition may be a non-starter. Maybe it's impossible to make them like that. So it may be very hard to tease out between these two.
We have a question from the online
Yes.
audition. Morgan Nuviash writes, great talk. I wonder, did you check the success of the newly founded nest? Maybe it's riskier than just staying on the old, well-developed nest, so that the fitness benefit is not so large.
Yes, that's true. Often the new nests fail. Very often they fail. So, but the problem is, if they go out and build a new nest, they get to produce a few offspring. They get some direct fitness. If they stay back, they may get no direct fitness and may only have to rely on indirect fitness. So how much indirect fitness you get will depend on how good that colony is. So if the parent colony is sort of deteriorating, then the odds are that it is better to go. So basically, I think they are somehow balancing the total fitness. So at home, I get more indirect fitness, small chance of getting some direct fitness. I go outside, I get no indirect fitness, I have some chance of getting direct fitness. So the sum of these two, somehow they seem to be balancing between these two.
Thank you. Any further questions?
More of a comment inspired by that last question, but I read about this economic principle that it states that people will work lower paid jobs if there are better opportunities for promotion. Might this be kind of an evolutionary equivalent of that because there's the additional opportunity for workers at some point to possibly develop into queens, that they will remain loyal workers for longer?
I think so. And not only that, the interesting thing is that working hard does not seem to diminish your future chances, which is what I would have expected. That makes it even more. And that's why we have argued that this is the best way to combine direct and indirect fitness. So sociality should evolve much more easily in a lineage like this, where there's no trade-off between indirect and direct. You can actually add them up. And that's why I think sociality evolves so rapidly in these things. Yes, there are other experiments we have done which sort of speaks a little bit to what you're saying. It's a fine balance. So let's say I know that I'm going to be the third in line. We know, for example, there are reproductive cues. We know that wasps know beforehand who will be the next queen and the next queen and the next queen. So we have shown these reproductive cues. We have also shown that the wasps know if this queen dies, who will be the next queen? Not me, someone else. They know that. We have shown all of that. The interesting thing is, if I know I am, say, third in the line, now I have two options. One is I know it's coming soon, so I should probably start eating more and building up and becoming strong and think of my life as a queen and prepare for that. The other thing is, but if I do that and something happens and I don't get my turn, then I lose everything. Or should I work very hard and make the nest healthy and big, so that when I become the queen, I have a very big healthy nest to help me. This, you can see that there is a very subtle balance between these two. And that's where we need to do more modeling and try. See, we can say all this verbally, but what I want is empirically testable predictions. So what I want to do now is to do more modeling and come up with empirically testable predictions which we can then test. So there's a twist to what you're saying. One thing is that I work hard as an incentive, but maybe there's also disincentive. So we'll have to see how this goes.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. I would like to thank you again. Wonderful talk.
Thank you.